Welcome, everyone. Uh, the title of our session is Heritage Disaster Response and Resilience. And I'm Rohit Jigyasu, Project Manager in Urban Heritage, Climate Change, and Disaster Risk Management at ECROM, which is headquartered in Rome. So, when we talk about disasters, we are really talking about so many events where cultural heritage has been impacted. Let's take the example of central Mexico, where there was an earthquake in 2017, and many very important cultural heritage sites in the city of Mexico were, and also in many other places were damaged. So, just to show you an example, not a long time back in Nepal, there was a huge earthquake. In fact, two major earthquakes in 2015, and many cultural heritage sites, including those which were on the World Heritage, were impacted. And here you can see one of the World Heritage sites of Bhaktapur, where a lot of damage happened. So we can see that disasters are very common and increasing, and the impact on cultural heritage is also devastating. Now, when we think about cultural heritage, it's not only monuments or major sites, but also museums that get impacted. And in the same earthquake in Nepal, we had this National Museum, which was damaged extensively, and this is actually their storage building. A lot of collection was trapped inside, and such a destruction kind of took place. Now, let's look at other kind of events. Notre Dame Cathedral, we all know about this major fire that damaged the spire and also many other important components of this World Heritage Site. And another example from another part of the world, in Rio, National Museum of Brazil was burnt due to fire, which happened due to short circuiting, and many important collections were damaged. And moving to another kind of event, floods, and we see that there are increased instances of floods now. And I'm sure our next speaker, Ali from IUCN, will be really expanding on how climate change is also an important element which is affecting climate-related disasters such as floods. Another examples from Paris, where the world-famous Louvre Museum was actually flooded twice, and a collection that was stored in the basement was at high risk because water came in the front yard, and they had to actually do one of the largest evacuation of collections since the World War. So when we think about disasters, we have to think about multiple hazards that create disasters, whether they are earthquakes, floods. I mean, let's not understand earthquakes or floods or fires as disasters. They are hazards that can trigger disasters. In fact, this whole terminology of natural disaster is a misconception. And there is nothing called natural disaster. It's about vulnerabilities and exposure of cultural heritage to these different events or hazards that create disaster at the end. So when we think about disasters and cultural heritage and also the relationship to resilience, we have to think about balancing human safety with heritage values. And that is the real challenge that we have to address when we think about cultural heritage in terms of disaster risk management. It's not easy because, of course, human safety is a priority, but then how do you deal with it when you also want to keep values to the maximum possible extent? And now moving to another dimension that we have to look at when we consider heritage and disasters is not to look at them only as vulnerable, but also look at them as assets that can contribute towards building disaster resilience. And there are ample examples from around the world which demonstrate how cultural heritage can actually positively contribute, whether it is through traditional building knowledge, like gingerbread houses in Haiti, which survived the earthquake because of the traditional wisdom, or wells and open spaces in Nepal, which were very useful when disaster struck because they could provide them with survival, resources at the time when municipality was not really operational. Or, in many situations, like in Japan, we have found heritage as an area which provides refuge to people. These temples became areas which could provide shelter to people and monks took care of them when actually they had nowhere else to go. So heritage actually became a source of resilience. So we have to think about both how to protect heritage from disasters, but also how to actually use heritage or build on heritage as a source of resilience, utilizing on the knowledge that heritage has, and also how to utilize traditional management systems, which are very useful for emergency preparedness and response. So that's the kind of a multi-dimensional view that we have to keep in mind when we think about disasters, risks, and resilience. And now I'm going to just end and then introduce the session objectives by mainly emphasizing on two aspects. On one hand, we have to think about integrating cultural heritage needs in disaster risk management policies at the national level, because many of these disaster management policies doesn't even have cultural heritage figured in them. So we have to bring them in, mainstream them in the larger disaster management world. But on the other hand, every cultural heritage site or institution needs to have its own disaster risk management plan or strategy. So we need to work on both ways. And ultimately, it's about protecting disasters what before the disaster takes place, which is in terms of prevention, mitigation, preparedness, and adaptation. What we need to do during a disaster, how do you respond, or how you provide first aid to people and cultural heritage, and of course, how do you deal with recovery and rehabilitation. So this is like the overarching disaster risk management, for which we have to kind of address multiple things in order to be better prepared our sites from various kinds of disaster risks. And this definitely implies that we have to kind of build bridges. And I hope that the case studies that we'll have this today will really help us show examples how we can build bridges between disaster risk reduction on one hand, sustainable development on the other hand, climate change adaptation, heritage conservation, and tourism management. So there are multiple connections there, and we need to really look at them and work out strategies. So with this in mind, the objectives of this session is to explore heritage's contribution to risk preparedness, disaster response and recovery, and also for long-term planning for disaster risk management. Secondly, how to better strengthen communities' resilience, which is an integral part of sustainable development. And thirdly, what kind of future research, practical actions, and partnerships are needed? And last but not the least, how can researchers work with practitioners, policymakers, and developers to maximize the ways heritage can contribute to various sustainable development goals, but mainly 11 and 13, which are actually dealing with cultural heritage? So this is the objective that we have set for ourselves, and I'm very pleased to now introduce our speakers. And maybe what I would just mention here is that these presentations, which I hope will be 10 minutes long, will be highlighting best practices, challenges, and lessons learned from the experiences of our presenters. And we hope that it will stimulate participants, which include researchers, practitioners, policymakers, in order to fine-tune the thematic subject of the session into practical actions towards achieving the sustainable development goals. So, and maybe on this basis, we can, in our group work that we will do later on, discussions, we can define what will be our future research agenda. So let's now turn to the presentations. And I'm very, very pleased to invite, first of all, my very good friend, Mr. Ali Raza Rizvi, who is a program manager, ecosystem-based adaptation at IUCN, which is International Union for Conservation of Nature. And I will, without further ado, I request Mr. Rizvi to kindly make his presentation. Over to you, Mr. Rizvi.
Thank you, Rohit. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I will be building upon Rohit's introduction to the session, and I will share with you overall IUCN's work, which we have been doing in climate adaptation, and then building upon it, that how that work could help us to better manage our cultural and natural heritage. And because that's the holistic view is needed, and then also because the problems are so multifaceted, it's not just one that we can do site management, but we need to look into landscapes overall, whatever is happening around us. So, as Rohit said, I am responsible for IUCN's global work on climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction. So, this presentation is based on most of our experiences, which are all over the world. Before going into that, let's just see that how, we cannot see disaster management and adaptation of heritage without looking into what is happening around us. It cannot be done in a vacuum. We need a holistic approach. And that's why the landscapes, wherever these heritage are, whether that's natural or or cultural, they play a role for its vulnerabilities and also disaster response. IUCN, as we see, all over the world, what we are doing, and in the climate change context, our outlook, which was published last year, and we can see that there are other challenges also. And as we see, only 50% of overall heritage they have management plan, and they too are at various level of implementation. So they already have issues and vulnerabilities because of lack of management planning or not implementation of those. And in the last 4 years, we have seen 16 sites have deteriorated quite huge number and only 8 improved. So that again, almost 50% in the management aspect, things are not working well. And then it, after all a study, that climate change has become the most prominent current threat to World Heritage sites. And we have rated them, and are most at least 83 of 252 sites are highly vulnerable to all these. And climate after invasive species and tourism is the most common threat now. And IUCN's work overall in climate adaptation, you can see we've been working all over the world. And in 94 countries, we have over 100 projects, which we are trying to cover most of the developing countries. And there, a lot of lessons are being learned. As you can see, the work we are doing is almost every region and in all landscapes, whether those are coastal marine or forested areas or other multiple sites where we've been working. And this main thing is that biodiversity and ecological integrity, that is critical to cultural heritage, because that is where they have the interplay. As I said earlier, we cannot see a site in isolation. So that's why these protected area management is critical on a landscape level, because that would help have better management practices in place to cope with disaster and climate induced hazards. And our main point is that, we have to look into a landscape approach, and that's the problem. It's happening that most of the time the management is very site specific. So I'm repeating myself because that's the key message which we have seen, why those sites, whether cultural and heritage, they are better managed or not managed. And that's why ecosystem based adaptation and disaster risk reduction measures, they come into play. And that's very critical that we look into the vulnerabilities as a whole. And that's how, as Rohit also shared, the disaster management cycle, we need to integrate climate risk at every level, whether we are into a response. So our response should be climate sensitive. Recovery level also, we need to look into the projected risk and vulnerabilities and mitigation. All this will help us to be better prepared. And that's how, if disaster helps, the preparedness will help us, that how would we be managing it and recovering from it. And In this one, vulnerability assessment, one tool which I would like to share with you is the red list of ecosystems, because that's a global standard for assessing ecosystem risk from collapse. So it provides a common framework looking into 30 years of risk, what are the previous risks, and also projects based upon available data, okay, what could be the risk in future. And considering all those risks, we can do management of these sites very effectively. As you can see, these are the broad areas which red list of ecosystem it covers, and that will help us, working with private sector stakeholders and looking into what is their stake in the management of these sites and how we can pool linkages and bring all the credibility together so that we can respond effectively. And overall conclusion is, again, everything is interlinked. We cannot see it in isolation. Climate change and disaster management, they need to come together. The problem is at the global level, also the global instruments which are being discussed at different fora, they rarely talk to each other. That's why we need to break the silos and bring them together so that we can have a joint effort and management planning. And at the same time, we need to look into the contribution of these cultural and natural heritage, because they can also play a critical role in management and response from climate change or disaster, because they provide, for example, natural heritage, they provide a buffer zone between the communities and people who live around those heritage sites. And if we involve them, and then it could be very holistic way of looking into the planning, assessment, and response. So that is the broad overview which we have seen all over the world. Wherever these sites are managed properly, they have a holistic view of the issues. And then also the response is not just site specific, but a holistic view, and where we have integrated approaches. And that's the major challenge we are facing all over the world, that rarely it is taken into practice. Climate change consequences are different than people who are managing protected areas and natural and cultural heritage. So they need to come together through fora like this, discuss the way forward, and then come up with planning which is based on best practices, but it should be equally applicable to the local sites. And that's where indigenous knowledge comes into play. And we need to see how climate science, climate data, indigenous knowledge, and then all responsive elements can come together and have a global level of framework, which is equally applicable with the right resources at the local level. So thank you. This is a broad overview. And then I believe other presenters will take you to the local level management aspects. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rizvi. I think that was a very eloquent presentation. You definitely stressed on the need for a holistic view, which looks at both nature and culture and linkages between disaster risk management and climate change adaptation. I'm sure there's a lot of discussion that we need to do and how to make this operational, how to implement this approach. So thank you again. Now I have the pleasure to invite Professor Robin Cunningham, who is UNESCO Chair in UNESCO Chair in Archaeological Ethics and Practice in Cultural Heritage, and Professor of Early Medieval Archaeology at the Department of Archaeology, University of Durham, UK, to make a presentation. So over to you, Professor Cunningham.
Thank you very much, Rohit, for the kind introduction. Thank you very much for setting the scene. You and Ali have provided a very useful overview. I've pre-recorded a presentation because my internet is not always reliable here, and sometimes it may sound as if I'm in a cave. But what I wanted to do was to give some key lessons learned from my experience as an archaeologist mobilized after the earthquake in Kathmandu in 2015. And some of those lessons learned that already we've seen that if they are co-designed in the right way, if they are responsive enough to work with other practitioners as well as community, there is a scalability and they can be shared and applied elsewhere. And most recently, we've seen them working not in a post-disaster environment, but actually in a post-conflict environment in northern Sri Lanka. So that scalability has to be key with every step forward we take. So if you could start my presentation and then I can sit back and listen to it. Thank you for the kind introductions and for the invitation to speak. What I'd like to do first is to provide a context for the area in which I work most, Southern Asia. In 2017, with support from a number of partners and funding from the Arts and Humanities Research Council, we held a major conference bringing together 300 individuals, policymakers, practitioners, academics, community and first responders from across South Asia to look at the threats to heritage within that region. They identified during the 2-week activities that the threats were from natural agency, both sudden and long term. For example, floods, earthquakes, landslides, wildfires and tsunamis, but also longer term climate change associated with increased rainfall or reduced rainfall, sea level rise and also salination. They also acknowledged the impact of human agency, sudden, rapid urbanization projects, mega infrastructure projects, conflict, iconoclasm, fires, looting, illicit trade, and inappropriate, swift post-disaster reconstruction. They also acknowledged the longer-term impacts of tourism and pilgrimage, cultivation, poor conservation, neglect, and the growth of plant species. And all of us at that meeting were also aware, as later stated in 2017, that cultural heritage, both tangible and intangible, could contribute to SDGs, in particular 11, but also 17. As early as 2014, Durham's UNESCO chair was also noting that heritage can contribute to SDG gains, but if handled or promoted in the incorrect way, could lead to losses against SDGs. I'd like to now look at a case study from the Gurkha earthquake of 2015. It was, of course, a human disaster, 9,000 dead, hundreds displaced, jobs lost, livelihoods, and also homes. And also many of the historic structures within Kathmandu demolished, such as this, the Kasta Mandap, thought to have been erected in about the 12th century, and Kathmandu's eponymous building. This is it after the earthquake. Very grateful to Kai Vaisi for this photograph. And this, you can see the shock of the disaster and the clearing. 1 minute, a protected monument, in the next, the monument becomes reclassified and debris. Some of the timbers collected together, but the majority of the material carted off and dumped with modern material. And at this time, in the post-disaster phase, engineers and architects reviewing many of the structures, viewing that the vernacular architecture had failed, completely demolishing them, removing the foundations, not recording them, and then reconstructing, often with new hybrid materials. So a team drawn from Kathmandu and broader across South Asia, including Durham's UNESCO chair, began to see how could we aid build back better at the ruin of the Kasta Mandap. So steadily over a 3-year project with teams of archaeologists, architects, Sanskritists, geotechnical engineers, as well as structural engineers and digital archivists, pulling together a project to record how could we understand the development and character, the morphology of this eponymous monument of Kathmandu. During the excavations, we were able to find in the upper level direct evidence of the damage from the JCBs, as well as the human legacy of the loss from the collapse and the earthquake. We're also able to demonstrate that the foundations of the structure had not been damaged by the earthquake, but actually had resilience. Indeed, the brick foundations linking into the timber superstructure, and also evidence of indigenous knowledge. This green patch is actually copper oxide, which retards biological growth and rot, and also prevents termite infestation. An indigenous knowledge practice since lost. And also a copper shoe on some of those wooden tenons, again part of the indigenous knowledge of maintenance. Together with absolute dating, we've now begun to build an idea of how the structure was erected from origins in the 7th to 9th centuries CE. Over 1,000 years old. If you think that there are probably one major earthquake every 100 years in the Kathmandu Valley, this demonstrates that vernacular architecture was remarkably well adapted and resilient. And it's only, we now believe, with recent conservation interventions in the 1960s that weaken the building. And indeed, with the absolute dating of some of the timber capitals, we found some of them indicate even earlier structure in the vicinities, this from the middle of the 1st millennium CE. We also recognize it's not just the science, it's also the community, their stories connected with the building, their experience of managing and using the building, and the intangible associated, which gives strength when the building collapsed. Having seen the damage through the emergency phase and the dumping, and recognizing that even UNDP's damage and debris management plan doesn't once mention heritage, we worked with first responders in Kathmandu to see if we could pilot a system where they themselves could record, not archaeologists, and also how we could recycle for all those hundreds of thousands of bricks dumped. Each one costs £1.40 to make today, with the associated environmental cost. Here's the first cohort of those who are being trained. But also sharing the awareness of the lessons learned. This is the old barracks at the Dakuti with Annie Joshi. This is Annie Joshi's dream of a community museum. A community museum where we could also commemorate loss, but celebrate resilience and indigenous knowledge. And here it is on the day of its opening by Her Excellency, the President of Nepal. The legacy is, of course, partly academic with our academic papers, but also handing over back to the community after the end of the research. That community then blending their own traditional practices with that lost indigenous knowledge to reconstruct, not using clever hybrids and scientific interventions, but actually reconstructing by hand. So what have we learned from this experience? We need, after disasters and before, to promote the multilateral, not merely for a team from one country to identify one area, one country, another area, but to promote multilateralism. Also to recognize that actually consultancies of a geotechnical or a structural or even an archaeological or a conservation will all come up with very different risks and solutions. Blending them together brings a multidisciplinary approach. We also need to consider whether fences around these core monuments for communities, actually portals where the heavens touch the earth, whether erecting fences around them, excluding people, is the fullest way to actually to be resilient, to build back better, not just technically and structurally, but also the intangible. Also to record and celebrate that evidence of indigenous knowledge and share the awareness of the learning through field visits like this one in Bhaktapur on the left, or through museum exhibitions such as the Dakuti Museum in Hanumandoka. But those museums having polyvocalism, not just the voices of the specialists, but also my earthquake story and artist's impression. Here we can see the Castor Mandap undergoing its reconstruction, but actually belonging to local artists. We also need to recognize what doesn't work and call it out, and also recognize that we must improve. We must improve our interventions, whether it be community interventions or our technical interventions. We must also understand the true meaning of legacy, that legacy is not just technical teams coming in showing what works well, but actually handing it over to the community so they take over the process and own the legacy once those teams have gone. The key challenge is remaining illegal, awareness of legal instruments and their application, resources, sharing technical equipment and professional knowledge, community, its engagement and custodianship, and also legacy. We lack the longitudinal data. Partly this is due to extremely short-term funding, different funding packages, and also we have to recognize that there is a longer-term commitment that needs to be made. And finally, we really need to accept that we need to offer and learn from more than just technical solutions. Here are some of the many teams that have contributed, the many organizations, the many funding bodies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Cunningham. You really presented some very interesting cases which bring out the importance, if I say, of Build Back Better, the importance of having a multidisciplinary approach, respecting the intangible, the spirit of multilateralism. I think these are very, very clear lessons that come out of your case study. So again, thank you so much for sharing this example from the ground. And I think that's the most important aspect of your presentation. So now I would be inviting Professor Jennifer Barclay, Professor of Volcanology, School of Environmental Sciences, University of East Anglia, and Dr. Karen Pascal, volcanologist, and from Montserrat Volcano Observatory, and Mr. Kelvin White of Montserrat Disaster Management Coordination Agency. So I think the presentation is going to be from Jennifer, and I will now invite Professor Jennifer to make her presentation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, can I just say a few words before we get going to say thank you very much? And just to give a little bit of context to this, what we're going to present is the creation of cultural heritage via a disaster. And we've taken the approach of inviting people from all different perspectives to come and talk, because I think that's something that's very important and that you've been emphasizing here. So take it away with the presentation. I live in the wilds of Norfolk, so I too have recorded a presentation. Thank you. Hello, my name is Jenny Barclay, and I'm part of the Disasters Class team. And I'm here today with Karen Pascal from the Montserrat Volcano Observatory to give you a brief introduction and to pose some questions that will hopefully excite some discussion. However, it's really important to acknowledge here that a project of a complexity like this and this level of interdisciplinarity is not something that you can do yourself. And I just want to start out by acknowledging some of the other people who've been involved in this project. So, volcanic eruptions, like so many of the hazards that are experienced in the Caribbean, pose particularly strong challenges for the volcanic islands of the Eastern Caribbean. We know that swift, strong, and inclusive recovery reduces the impact on livelihoods and well-being, and it improves resilience towards future events. And what we also know is that while building strong physical infrastructure is of course important, further benefits accumulate faster when these approaches are inclusive and tailored to the local cultural and social environment. And our past research on various projects has demonstrated the incredibly strong value of cultural responses to volcanic eruptions in the Caribbean. So the aims of Disaster Past were really to celebrate and publicise these responses and share the value of that knowledge, particularly for future generations in that environment. We wanted to create tangible objects on both Montserrat and St. Vincent, which have experienced recent and past eruptions, to use in the future. And of course, these did not have to be designed and orchestrated by us. Further, what we wanted to do was to distill that message of resilience and cultural response for those who respond to disasters in the Caribbean, including those in the UK. And in doing this project in a kind of rounded way, what we wanted to do was delve a little deeper into those responses as well through the course of the project. So I'm going to show you some examples of what we've got, but just to start out with, this is who and where we have engaged. This is the exhibit that's on St. Vincent. We have two exhibits. We'll show you some footage of the one on Montserrat in just a minute. A smaller exhibit for the UK called Nest. And then also we created a website as a bridge, but also a repository and a long-term data source for the cultural responses to this eruption. And this is where we have been able to engage on both Montserrat and St. Vincent. And then, of course, via the websites, we have UK and worldwide impact. So what I really want to do is just introduce you to these. So I'm just going to switch now to showing you our trailer for the Mountain Aglow exhibit. So this is the Soufriere Hales volcano on Montserrat here, and you can see the thriving and lively community and population that there are on the island associated with this eruption. This is some speeded up footage of us erecting one of the physical exhibits, and this is the Montserrat volcano. And one of the things that we did in response to what happened in the Caribbean and the feedback that we got was we actually tried to create something that showed the internal workings of the volcano. So the scientific response married with the cultural response. And you can see here, this is the mountain at the opening of the Montserrat Literary Festival, where we debuted the volcano and then showed it. And obviously what you've also seen is some footage of school children enjoying this, because as we say, what we want to do is a legacy. And I think Karen's going to talk a lot more about the engagement with people that we have done throughout this process. So as I said, the other thing that we wanted to do was ensure that we had a long-term legacy and repository for some of this response. And this is the first of these two websites. There'll be a master website that joins with St. Vincent called Disaster Past. But this is the website that is, in the words of the local people, the choice of the exhibit called Mountain Aglow, which refers to the way the mountain looks when it was in the process of eruption. So this is just to introduce you to what we have sitting on this website through the Explore function. You can see here what we did was we set this website out in the way that people wanted us to talk about it. So talking through themes rather than through timelines. So talking about the experience of having to leave the island, talking about some of the resilient dimensions. But most importantly, these are accounted for in the words of those people who experienced the eruptions itself. So here's the experience of ash falling, people talking about ash falling, and then various types of experience of images and songs that relate to that as well. So we've kind of classified it sort of as a living archive. And through the process of creating this website, we have actually solicited some further interaction, and people can add and change things and comment on them. And we were very careful to collect data both across from Montserrat and from the UK. So I don't want to take up too much more of the time with this, but I just kind of want to leave with a comment before we move on to Karen and her guests talking about this. One of the big consequences for us in terms of what looks like a very kind of interactive experience is, of course, time. And I kind of think of it as the several continuous rotating circles of engagement. So they're starting with their own research, and then, of course, making sure that we understand what people remember and value, And then obviously one of the other critical things that we were interested in is the risk messages for the people embedded in them when we're thinking about what we want for the future generation. All of these have fed into our exhibit and website and materials. And of course, because we have several products, he has fed through and taken a process of evaluation, and we've constantly tried to improve on what we're doing.
All right, so as Jenny was saying, I'm going to speak more specifically about the Montenegro exhibit and actually website as well, the collection of the data mostly, and the collaborative aspect of it. Because it takes a village, as you say in English, but actually it really takes a world in this type of issues. So just to give a bit of background for those who don't know Montserrat, it's a small island in the Caribbean, and in the Caribbean we are really used to live with natural disasters. The thing with the Soufrière Hills eruption, which started in 1995, is that it's a very long disaster, and it had some huge impact on the life on island, and it's reflected in the arts as well, and in the culture in general. So as you can see, like just a few points, like the capital was destroyed, and a lot of thriving communities around the volcano. 2/3 of the island is still not accessible. There were huge demographic transformation with 75% of the population emigrating at some point, and then immigrations. And so now we are at about 5,000 people, basically, with 50% of the population being of Montserrat origin and 50% being of other origin. There were like a huge rupture, a lot of ruptures of family and community links, also an increased political dependency to the UK. Montserrat is a UK overseas territory, and metamorphosis of landscapes with valleys filled up, for instance. And so all of this really reflects and shows that there was a huge amount of the heritage which was lost, but this heritage is still kept alive by the people and transferred through memories and through arts. And there is also, as Jenny was saying, a creation of new knowledge, for example, the scientific knowledge. So as I was saying, Montenegro is really a collaborative work, both because we wanted it, but also because it is needed to have collaborative approach to make it possible when it comes to gather data which are related which are related to culture, and also for this project to be impactful on the ground. So that's collaboration, international, regional, and locals as well. That was within institutions, with community groups, with individuals, and all of these people having overlapping knowledge and interests. That took a long time. Connecting and building trust takes a long time. It takes to listen to people, to respect people, and to realize that they own their culture and that we are just here eventually to with our own perspective and to use it for disaster response and preparedness. So it requires as well to integrate rather than dismiss or select just the contributions that are good for us. It requires time and efforts from everybody, both those who are giving you their memories or their photos or whatever, and also for the people who are actually leading the project, more collaborations, on the more doing the project, if you want. And obviously, we also need to be careful with the permission. So we had, for instance, a huge amount of work done on consent forms and on permissions for photos, for artwork. And also, we have to be careful with not re-traumatizing the people. I broke the picture apparently, but so the people that we engaged are both in Montserrat and within the Montserrat diaspora. And so that's institutions, community groups. You can see here some details and some individuals and some artists. And we engaged with group meetings, both with institutions, project partners, and with people who actually, for instance, told us what themes they would like to see on the project. We organized tour to Plymouth for like a down to memory lane kind of trip. Meetings like with potential users, email updates of like project to collaborators and partners, and people who had participated in general, individual interviews of people, and of course a lot of requests, a lot of for photos, for songs, for whatever we could use really. So to speak about the evaluations and the future basically of the project. So yes, I think, well, at least I see this project as a success. It was used in various locations. It's a good tool to communicate about this volcanic disaster. On the feedback forms that we created, the people actually like it, in fact, not just usually. And some people who actually participated to the project own it and like to use it and speak about it with people that they know. Some collaborators are also giving support, for instance, like storage, not storage of staff, but storage of the actual exhibit, and also help with staff to help and installing and disinstalling, and creating that also. This project also created and strengthened connections between institutions and with the people. But there are significant aspects that we omitted, not necessarily consciously, maybe because it was easier. And that's, for instance, religion and local politics, which are very important aspects of the Montserrat life. We haven't reached a lot of the population, and the project is still carried mostly by MVO. And again, like people and kids like it, but we don't always, they don't necessarily always remember the message of it. So that's my last slide. So now we are trying to address all these issues with another step of the project, which is the collaboration with, where we are going more in depth with the collaboration with the Disaster Management Coordination Agency, the DMCA, and the schools. In this project, we are really giving the power to the 8 and 10 years old kids to create their own panel. So that will be kind of an alternative exhibit, if you want. We are giving talks. We are inviting local guests like politicians and artists to come and work with the kids, local designers as well. We took the exhibit through the schools, and we are planning, for instance, a guided visit in Plymouth. And for like seeing a little bit further, as you were saying at the beginning, everything and everybody is interlinked. So there is a need for international, regional, and local collaborations. I'm not sure what I wrote here, but basically, for the project to be impactful, they have to be carried by several institutions and by several people, and for them as well to be in the long term, basically. The knowledge has to be shared between academics and people on the ground. We need to give a voice. We need to give a choice to people as well on the ground. And so I think there are specific sessions which will address these issues actually. And maybe, you know, some solutions might also be in the training of researchers, for instance, to include sensitization to collaborative approaches at school. And thank you very much. Sorry if I went too long, and I'm going to leave the mic to Kelvin.
Good day, and thanks for having me. I'll try to stick to my time. Okay, so I'll be covering from a disaster management standpoint. Give a brief history of disaster management from, let's say, from 2021 back to 1988. Disaster management in Montserrat post Hurricane Hugo, which was a devastating hurricane in 1989, has transitioned from a humble beginning of a single desk and a part-time post of a disaster coordinator to where we are now engaging and interacting with the public as a main means of making sure that they're safe during a disaster. One of the things that has inherently been evident post Hurricane Hugo was the dependence on the community on the disaster office to give them guidance and advice as it relates to preparation and mitigation against disasters. Montserrat and the Caribbean as whole is prone to disasters. Over the last 25 years, we have been living with an active volcano, and it drives home the importance of having that community partnership and buy-in in terms of what we are trying to achieve in terms of our disaster management mandate. One of the things that we have done so far is, as part of our educational outreach programs, we have broadened our horizons in terms of the various platforms that we use to engage the vast demographic of our population. We also produce information in both French Creole and Spanish, which caters to our migrant population, which is on island. It has proved dividends over the years, and it is so that persons have gained in confidence in terms of the information that we put out. In recent times, as part of the partnership with the MVO and the Mountain Aglow program, we have seen the enthusiasm and interest of persons as relates to this project, and it helps to, in terms of galvanizing our volcanic history. It also helps to engage the younger population, the youth, in terms of engaging them in a fun and interactive atmosphere. And it is evident by some of the questions that we would see persons asking, especially young persons. And one of the hopes that we're having is that this program, this project can actually encourage some young person to actually maybe consider volcanology as a means of a vocation. But in terms of the social aspect of this project, it helps to ensure that persons are aware of the history and the heritage of Montserrat. And this is something that we look forward to continuing in partnership with the MVO.
Thank you very much for excellent presentation by our three speakers. I think we have really brought out one important element, which was very nicely put in the beginning, that we have to combine technical aspects with the cultural elements, and it's very important to bring them together. Only technology will not solve. How to engage people, how to really understand the cultural dimensions are so much critical for effective success of the initiative. So that was very much brought out by this presentation. Now we are going to have a quick round of question and answer, and I'm going to just pose a few questions to the panelists based on the ones that have been sent to us. Just a moment. I'm going to first pose a question from Carlos Jaramillo. And he says, we often see climate change as a matter of mitigation and risk assessment. when addressed by cultural heritage institutions. We forget that cultural heritage mirrors life. That is why it is relevant, because it sheds light on the past. How we lived, how we loved, and how we understood life, to mention only a few. Therefore, the impact of current events like climate change should and must be reflected on heritage assets. Why don't we assess heritage consumption in terms of its contribution to carbon dioxide emissions rather than dubious criteria such as aesthetics, historicity, and identity? Why in 70 years the cultural heritage industry has been incapable of designing standards like any other industry to interconnect heritage to other sectors, fields, and industries? So he further asks, where are the economists of where are the other disciplines? So maybe I will pose this question, very challenging one, to Ali. Ali, maybe you would like to respond to this one.
Thank you, Rohit, and thank you for asking this question. It's very important. I won't say it's either or. Aesthetic, beauty, history, others are important, and that's why this sector is there for heritage. But at the same time, it's a good suggestion that we need to look into climate adaptation, climate change as a part of it. So I trust the way it's been said, carbon emissions must be, because the sites don't do per se, it's more how those are managed. So that again comes back to management aspects of it and tourism, associated tourism. Having standards is very, very critical. Let me share very quickly that climate change, disaster, they are still struggling having standards, because it's very difficult where, the response is not just about one aspect of things. Climate resilience of yours and mine is not just dependent on one element. It is everything which is around us. So having standards in one area won't work. Others will nullify it. So that's why it's critical that conservation sector, together with the development and built environment, they all have standards, and those must be followed. So I fully support that standards are needed. And if you're interested, we can share with you, and I will try to put in the chat. Ecosystem-based adaptation have developed standards 2017 with stakeholders, and that's where we are trying to apply those. But again, it's an effort of the whole sector. But I like the idea, we need to come, but it's not an either or case one way.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your response. So there's another question I'll pick up from Alison Brody. So Alison asks, you have talked a lot about risks of disasters for physical heritage and the role of organizations in disaster risk reduction and adaptation, but I don't feel I have heard much about the responsibility to support people, including the poorest, whose lives and livelihoods may depend on local heritage. How can we ensure a holistic approach that has their needs and voices inform disaster risk reduction and reconstruction processes? And what examples are there for heritage-focused organizations working with NGOs who work primarily with local communities or in or near heritage sites? So maybe I'll, if I may ask this question to Professor Cunningham, if he would like to respond from his experience to this kind of challenging question.
Thank you. It is a very challenging question, and what I'd say is, first of all, as I try to put in my presentation, frequently the community are locked out. So in Nepal, in particular, where we worked, sites were just fenced. The reconstruction process, tenders being offered, big multilateral sort of projects, bilateral projects coming in, and actually the community were excluded. And what was really interesting, that what happened was actually activists began to make their voices heard. Local communities began to make their voices heard. As part of a project we had partly funded by the British Academy, we did a survey of 300 people in the vicinity of the Castor Mandap, and many of them were just saying, we aren't part of the process of rehabilitation, we're not listened to. And they were saying, I used to stop people putting their washing on the monuments. Now I feel that I'm less involved in this. As a result of those community voices, actually the local elected politicians began to move forward with this. And then they were the ones who said, we will, as wards, reconstruct this monument. We will create our new and blend with our intangible heritage to reconstruct this. They are then the ones who fitted out the museum. And what's interesting is you look at the balance. Our AHRC grant for this project was £90,000. The government of Nepal put into the reconstruction 1.2 million. Now, in a way, once our project had finished, actually the legacy of the interaction is now there. That museum, which is the community museum, is actually there. So I'd say, I don't think there is particular planning or acceptance or understanding that the community must be involved, but that custodianship is far beyond anything that actually a bilateral aid package can offer. And I used to believe tangible was strong, intangible was weak, always changing. In Kathmandu, around a pile of rubble, you could see the daily rituals taking place. It was the place that was specific, and that's the lesson you have to learn. The community and their custodianship, that link cannot be damaged, cannot be broken.
Very nice. Thank you so much for answering this very eloquently. So now there's another question, which in fact is it's about intangible heritage, because I mean, there is a lot of talk about intangible, but what is the treatment of intangible heritage in disaster times? Is anyone having an experience to share about dealing with, I mean, we all talk about dealing with tangible heritage in disaster times, but how about the intangible heritage? So any one of the panelists would like to make a very brief intervention on this aspect, on how intangible heritage is addressed.
So, yes, I would say our entire project is about the value of that intangible heritage. But I just noticed that Kelvin has his hand up. So maybe he, as a disaster manager, wanted to comment on some of this. Kelvin.
Yes, I wanted to comment on the previous question that was asked. One of the things that we do from our disaster office is that we ensure that we have community engagement as it relates to the vulnerable persons. Also from the social services office, they do generate annually and update a vulnerable persons list, which is shared around the hurricane season, which helps us to guide in terms of if there's a hurricane, we know who and we were going to target in terms of assistance. Also, we have a number of hurricane shelters or emergency shelters that would be activated. I mentioned before in my presentation, in terms of us targeting persons of other nationalities, such as the French Creole and the Spanish-speaking community that we have on island. They themselves are vulnerable in terms of the fact that the challenge in terms of the language barrier. So we ensure that we cater to those type of persons also. Our engagement in terms of local stakeholders, we use different platforms to reach different persons. One of the things that we look at are single house or single parent households. How do we engage these persons? So through our education and outreach program, We have a weekly program, Prepare and Prevent, which is widely popular on Ireland, and all across the diaspora, we've been having comments in terms of the effectiveness of these programs. So in terms of addressing the vulnerable persons, we do try our best to ensure that we have as wide a coverage as possible and a far reach in terms of engaging these persons so that they know what their vulnerabilities are and what to do when they need to do it.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Very well responded. So, and with this, we will end the first part of our session. Thank you to all the presenters and to all those who have raised very interesting questions. I can see that there is a very interesting chat going on, many interesting comments being posted. So, I think we have a very, very stimulating kind of dialogue here as we. Now, I will invite Tilly to really introduce the breakout session. So, over to you, Tilly.
Thanks, Rohit, and thanks everyone. They were really great discussions. So I'm really excited to see where the breakout groups take us.
We had quite a wide-ranging discussion. I think we spoke indirectly to quite a lot of the questions, possibly research, but also partnerships. So on the partnership side, we had a really example of how unexpected partnerships in a way could be something we need to think about. One of our colleagues gave the example of the Notre Dame roof being burned, and that one of the resources for actually understanding what that looked like was actually from a gaming company who'd assessed it for another reason and not necessarily from other sources. So we discussed a little bit about how new kinds of partnerships or new thinking about partnerships could be something we should actually look at. Another area that was talked about was the whole issue of, we had a colleague from Iran who's now working in the Netherlands who was talking about the problem of lost knowledge to do with architecture and disaster responses and architecture that's actually addressing issues of disaster readiness, and that we need to address the issue of how we make sure the right kind of knowledge is retained. Another example we had related to knowledge, but I think all these things I've mentioned actually speak to possibilities for new kinds of research, is the whole issue of the kinds of practices that the larger institutions and at global level we think are the right kind of practices for engaging in addressing disasters and working with communities, but that we ought to have some critical work on the values that underpin those practices. And if those values don't really reflect the communities who come from the areas we're actually talking about and the indigenous knowledge that those communities have and the way they would go about risk management, etc., then that's really problematic. And it actually looks at the way that perhaps, even though these might be good regimes and good practices, they're really rather Western centered and historical rather than forward looking and much more critical. And then we had another really good discussion about lost knowledge in a way, but that's actually to do with communities and cultural heritage itself in climate change, etc., where you actually lose habitable areas and resources such as churches and schools, as well as heritage infrastructures are lost, which could have a long-term damage on the culture, not least for other peoples coming in from other areas and locating themselves there, and perhaps threatening, perhaps completely inadvertently, but just by being there and having other practices, the kind of culture that previously was there. So that's the idea of how do we preserve cultural knowledge over the dramatic change that's going to have with communities shifting to do with climate change and other kinds of disasters. I think that's the main areas, but Helen will come in and add anything else if I've missed anything.
Okay, I think we have group number, our group 2 will be the next one. So maybe I can request Kate to make a summary or presentation on our discussions. Kate, please.
We had a very good discussion. It was wide-ranging, and we were particularly interested in the possible areas of research. So one very interesting one was a plea for more ethnographic research. And that we had quite a humble approach, because we felt that we shouldn't always assume we were the peacemakers. What we wanted reconstructed and so on was not necessarily the solution that local population might want. There was some thought about developing methodologies across different economic situations. And in particular, here, there was one example of understanding the economic situations, particularly in conflict areas, which led to illicit trafficking and which meant that we should really engage more with these vulnerable communities, and that should inform our decisions better, particularly in those unstable regions. There was also a very interesting point about the power dynamics between what the national and international communities wanted and the local communities' needs and expectations needed to be understood as the project was being designed and not afterwards. That was another point. So respecting local views came out very, very strongly indeed. We shouldn't pretend we are the peacemakers and that gap. There was also a very interesting point in the partnerships and collaborations point that the geoscientists, this was a very interesting point, tended to be quite siloed at university, and this permeated throughout their professional life. So this was a very interesting area that we felt they should engage more from day one as students, and should be encouraged perhaps through changes to the curriculum to engage more with the potential relation of their professions with cultural heritage issues. And then one more detail was again the question of debris management, and that came up in two areas, in the earthquake, as we heard before, but whether it could also be in coral, which is a limited supply of, but also in Zanzibar. So this is obviously an issue that crops up across the world, and perhaps that should be noted for future research. So that's a very, very brief summary of what we said. And if anyone would like to add from our group the things that I've left out, perhaps the facilitators can manage that too. Thank you.
We actually got into the discussion straight away, so we had like a last minute decision on who's going to report. So I hope I don't miss out anything important, and please add in case I do. I think we started by answering the question as to how we can look at cultural heritage in terms of disaster response. And I think one of the first points that came across was the importance of not underselling the power of community cohesion. So community which has faced a sense of trauma and loss in such an event also has a degree of cohesiveness to how and a say over how reconstruction processes would take place thereafter. So here I think we could say that I think we were all agreed upon how that whole process of inclusion, and as practitioners, it's important to be facilitators towards such processes was agreed upon. We also discussed there were examples of methodologies for co-designing such in such cases. We briefly talked about the knowledge of traditional architecture, in the sense of the knowledge of construction which has been prevalent over the ages, which may have been lost over time. But there were notable examples to showcase how even in disaster scenarios, traditional architectural methodologies have sustained. And towards that end, we also had a discussion we touched upon the whole idea of how we look at heritage in general, as to who is the practitioner who has a say in what is defined as heritage, and what kind of discourses may be more authorized because of official agencies. And I think, as it was mentioned in group 2 as well, I think the whole idea of community at the center was insisted upon. And we briefly also discussed the kind of gender roles which are a part of such processes in terms of when we are talking about heritage disaster responses. I think that's mainly it. I hope I was clear enough. Thank you.
And also, I just wanted to mention here that this was such a stimulating session, and the kind of discussions that we had, I think, really bring us so much more towards what we need to do as a next step beyond this. So this really helps us to put together a kind of agenda of action for research and practice. And I hope that all these discussions the report that will come out of this session will be very, very useful for us to move ahead. One thing that I would just like to mention here is that it was very clear that we cannot work in isolation. We cannot work in a kind of shell. We need to work in a very collaborative, multidisciplinary manner. We need to bring research with practice. We have to link research with practice. We have to link nature with culture. We have to link climate change with disaster risk management. So the essence of really ensuring that we are able to manage our cultural heritage sites, protect them from disasters, is really requiring us to work in a very holistic manner and really break down all those boundaries that deter us from collaboration. So I would just say that it's really been a very productive time listening to everyone, and I would like to thank all the presenters, all those who have put up such interesting questions and comments. And of course, the final wrap-up session was indeed also very, very interesting. So congratulations to the organizers and to all those who had participated. Over to you, Francesca.
Thanks, Rohit, and to echo you, thank you everybody for the wonderful and productive session today. And I think it was really interesting. And there are a few themes that start emerging from all the sessions we have had so far, like the need to stop working in silos, promoting more interdisciplinary and then integrated approaches. But also, and here I'm introducing also the sessions we will have tomorrow. Also, the needs of changing to strengthen the capacity building process for both for both heritage professionals, but also for local communities and for international, national, and local institutions. So this is something we'll be discussing tomorrow morning. So we have a session on rethinking capacity strengthening for sustainable development, running from 10 to 12 UK time. Please remember, be careful with the different time zone. I know it's annoying, but we need to be careful. It's UK time. And then also another theme that emerged a lot today, or in relation both to the theme of biocultural heritage, linking nature and culture, but also to this afternoon when discussing disaster response and resilience, is the issue of climate change and how can heritage be used also to mitigate climate change impacts. So this will be food for thought for the sessions we will have tomorrow afternoon, which is entitled Bridging the Gaps, Cultural Heritage for Climate Action, and it will be held from 3 to 5 p.m. UK time again. So I look forward to meet you tomorrow or in another one of the next sections. And I thank you very much, all of you, Rohit, the panelists, the facilitators, and all the participants, and as well as our tech support. And see you soon. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a nice rest of the day.